All right. And just quick check, Jamie, can you see my opening slide here? Great. Well, all right, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this week's webcast, The Future of Eastern Oregon's Forests. Please note that we have a closed captioning option available at the bottom of your screen. This presentation will be recorded and published on our blog and YouTube page, where it will also include a closed caption option. My name is Rob Clavins. I'm the Northeast Oregon Field Coordinator for Oregon Wild. I'm based in unincorporated Wallowa County, just outside the town of Enterprise, where my wife and I own and operate Barking Mad Farm, a working farm and guest house. I'm here with my colleagues, friends, and neighbors, Jamie Dawson and Dr. David Mildrexler. David was born and raised in Oregon. He is a systems ecologist who works for Eastern Oregon Legacy Lands and the Wallawaology Discovery Center, which has a really wonderful interpretive center on the main street in Joseph that everyone should visit when you're here. He and his family live in Enterprise. They also own and manage forested land near the Eagle Cap Wilderness. David serves on the board of the Wallowa Land Trust and works with the Nez Perce tribe and local organizations in the Blues to Bitter Roots Partnership. He received his bachelor's degree from Portland State University, a master's in forest science from the University of Montana, and a PhD in forest ecosystems and society from Oregon State University. David has been involved in scientific research, education, and ecosystem conservation in the Blue Mountains for decades. In recent years, he has published groundbreaking, internationally important research with practical applications. We'll hear about some of that today as it relates to the importance of the often overlooked forests of Eastern Oregon that are not as cut and dry as you might think, pun fully intended. I will give a very brief update about the Forest Service's latest efforts to create new plans for these forests. And then Jamie Dawson will bring us home to tell you about opportunities to make your voice heard in the process and share a vision that we hope the agency will also embrace to ensure a just process with positive outcomes for human and non-human communities alike. Jamie should be a familiar face. After 5 years working with Oregon Wild, she, her partner, and their wonderful dog moved to Wallowa County, where she serves as the conservation director for Greater Hells Canyon Council, the state's oldest conservation organization and one of our most effective and dependable allies. Jamie started her career conducting bird research and doing rural science education in Alaska. She also worked for the National Park Service in Glacier National Park. She's an active volunteer in many community efforts and is a current board member of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. After that, we'll have some question and answers, and you can enter your questions at any time. And I encourage you to do so as you think of them rather than waiting for the flood at the end. We'll end the formal presentation in an hour, but if we have a few unanswered questions, we'll stick around a little longer and do our best to answer them. If you got a raffle ticket, thank you. Your support allows us to continue our work and host these presentations. The raffle winner will be drawn tomorrow morning, so it's not too late to enter on the Oregon Wild homepage. Winners, we will contact you by email to verify your shipping address. And then I also want to quickly note that we have some exciting events coming up. In Portland, Oregon Wild will host our annual Call of the Wild event next Friday, the 13th, and kick off our 50th anniversary. For those of you near La Grande, Greater Hells Canyon Council has their annual gala in La Grande this Saturday, and the auction is live wherever you may live. And lastly, here in Wallowa County, Wallawaology is hosting a presentation by our good friend, Dr. Angela Sandana of the Nez Perce tribe on Friday, October 20th, and she'll be discussing condor recovery in Hells Canyon. Information on all of those is on our respective websites. And importantly, before we start, I want to note that all three of us are presenting to you from lands that were stolen from the Nimiipuu or Nez Perce tribe by force. That includes our public lands, but also our cities, our farms, ranches, homes, and businesses that are all located on unceded lands that were never given to us or to our government. We're going to be talking about lands, living communities, values, and systems that have been core to the Nimiipuu and other people since time immemorial. We do not speak for them. They have their own stories and knowledge that are uniquely theirs to tell and share as they see fit. And I want to note that, while a land acknowledgement does virtually nothing to right historic wrongs, we are committed to doing our best to create and foster genuine relationships that help us create a better future for all of us that call this place home, human and non-human alike. And now I'm going to turn things over to David. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Rob. I will start my screen share here. Thank you, Rob, for that very nice introduction. It's great to be here with you two wonderful folks here tonight, and in this there was a very nice and fun spirited introduction, which has got me in a really good mood. So thank you for that. It's great to be with you all here on this Wild Wednesday webcast. Thanks for taking your time out of your busy schedules to be here with us today to talk about something that's really near and dear to our heart, these beautiful ecosystems of the Blue Mountains. So without any further ado here, let's see. Rob mentioned I'm systems ecologist with Eastern Oregon Legacy Lands, and you may have come into the Willowology Discovery Center before. If you haven't, as Rob mentioned, please do. Or maybe you've been out on one of our outings with us into the Blue Mountains to places like you can see right here in the background, Joseph Canyon. I've led, hundreds of people on outings into this landscape, school groups, elders, children, sharing the beauty of this world. The future of Eastern Oregon forest, the global importance of the Blue Mountains, a wonderful topic for me to be able to talk about here tonight. These are some of the topics I'm going to go through here: climate, Blue Mountains introduction and some of its unique characteristics, talk about large trees, strategic forest reserves, and building a system for this region, which to this point, this amazing landscape you can see behind you here. I like to start with it because it does show you what a part of the Blue Mountains has probably looked like this for thousands and thousands of years. You can see this is a highly intact system. There's no roads in here. This is the heart of the roadless area, reaching up into the Wallowa Valley and onto the snow-capped peaks of the largest wilderness in the state of Oregon, the Eagle Cap. So just showing people visually what an intact, resilient landscape looks like here in the Blue Mountains. And also, I want to just emphasize that, to put us into the state of mind of where we are here today and what we're talking about, this historic map shows Nez Perce place name stretching from the Pacific Ocean all the way into the far Rocky Mountains. The star is at the picture where you just saw. That's where Joseph Canyon is located. You can see the familiar things: the Columbia River, the Snake River Basin, some of the mountain ranges you can make out in there. There's a familiarity to it, but it's also very, very different. And this is how this land was for thousands and thousands of years for all the indigenous people that lived here. And just a reminder too that, just to think about how connected this landscape was, how full of wildlife it was, and to really broaden our thinking about what historical, conditions were on a landscape like this when it was all connected across this entire incredible region that we still call home here today. I wanted to start with this background on climate. This is the last 24,000 years of history, one of the most carefully resolved climate data sets that we now have. The thing that I pointed out there, that little red arrow on the x-axis, 16,000 years ago is the history of the Nez Perce in this region. And it just boggles my mind when I look at that map and I see where we were just in the Ice Age, just coming out of that period still for thousands of years, and the history of the people, the Nez Perce in this landscape, the knowledge that they have about how to survive change. It's something that we really are excited to be partnering with them in this homeland of theirs. Also, just want to draw your attention to this chart. It shows the Holocene and really the last 10,000 years of human civilization, where every single thing that we know today as this world we experience, the civilizations we live in, the cities, the societies, the agricultural systems, everything developed in that part of the curve that is incredibly, incredibly stable. There's very low variability throughout this period, and all of the variability people talk about, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, solar forcings, all happened within that incredible period of stability. So now, at the current moment, we have warmed more in the past, as I'll give you the exact words of the authors on this. It's an amazing thing. The magnitude and the rate warming over the last 100 years far surpasses the magnitude and rate of changes over the last 24,000 years. So this warming that we've seen per unit time is just like nothing else we've seen. We are at 1.2 degrees global warming, beyond the warmest point since we left the Ice Age. And we know that this 1.5 degrees Celsius is a very serious climate planetary boundary beyond which Earth system resilience is threatened. So when we zoom out into space, we're in the International Space Station, looking across the Pacific Northwest here, this incredible region. You can see the blue mountains, snow-capped mountains reaching across from the Cascades to the Rockies. This atmosphere is very, very thin. The troposphere, which holds about 90+% of all of the mass of the atmosphere, is about the distance from Joseph to Enterprise. And we're simply filling it up with carbon emissions. And this is something humanity has to address rapidly, is reducing the emissions of fossil fuel into the atmosphere. My master's advisor, Steve Running, used this slide and just did a lot of incredible work on climate communication to the people. And there is a growing awareness of the seriousness of this issue, but we really are bumping up against incredibly important thresholds in the Earth system now, and we need to be very mindful of actions right now in this coming decade. And so where is all this carbon going when we put it into the atmosphere? It's not all staying there. Actually, a lot of what this chart shows is above the y-axis, above zero, is all of the emissions that we've been putting into the atmosphere. You can see that in gray, and then you can see the orange is the land use component, okay? So all of our deforestation and logging and other activities that release carbon to the atmosphere from land use. Below the zero line is where all that carbon is going. And you can see there's been a lot going into the ocean sink, and a lot going into the land sink, and also into the atmosphere. But note, as those emissions have increased, the planet has also used its biophysical systems to pull more carbon out of the atmosphere and try to keep things in balance. This is why the Holocene was so stable. The Earth is a finely tuned system, and it's been doing this now for quite a while. So what you're really seeing here is a planet, a healthy planet, a resilient planet, trying to keep this Earth in balance. And it's working incredibly hard. We think about 50% of all of our emissions that we've ever put out has been taken up by nature. Scientists are now calling this the largest subsidy to the human economy ever. In other words, if it wasn't for nature doing this job, the warming we'd already be experienced would have pushed us far past habitable thresholds. And so, this isn't a doom and gloom talk, though. And, I study this stuff every day. So, there are solutions to this problem. And the forest system, as you just saw in that previous slide, is a big part of working to keep carbon out of the atmosphere. It's the most important land sink that we have. They're taking up upwards of 30% of all the emissions that we're putting out into the atmosphere. Temperate forests have been taking up 44% of that. And they're not just important for climate, they're crucial for biodiversity, supporting something like 85 to 90% of critical habitat for species on the planet. And the water security is very, very much dependent upon forest ecosystems. Places all over the world are dependent on forests for their drinking water. And all this is now very well laid out in the IPCC report, okay? Look at this language. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. There's a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. The choices and actions implemented in this decade will have impacts now and for thousands of years. That's an incredible statement right there. And it just means that the actions we take in this decade are the most crucial. They have the most time to play out in the atmosphere, either way, either for our benefit or for our harm. So actions we take now are absolutely crucial to keep us below that 1.5 and well below the 2 degrees climate threshold, which we've never been above in the last 3 million years of Earth's history. And then look at this last quote here below. Maintaining the resilience of biodiversity and ecosystem services at the global scale depends on effective and equitable conservation of approximately 30 to 50% of Earth's land, freshwater, and ocean areas, including currently near natural ecosystems. So this is the scientists at the IPCC saying, folks, there is no way to achieve 1.5 without taking advantage of these natural solutions, without the intact processes of the Earth functioning. There's no more safe landing possible. We have crossed that threshold. Even if we cut all fossil fuels, if we don't have these natural functioning systems, we cannot achieve these important climate thresholds. So this is literally a planetary boundary on land, and it's a big step towards integration of all sciences to try to solve this problem. And this is where we work. And so as we think about that, that climate background, that's the kind of science that I bring into my work on the Blue Mountains. And it's part of the reason why I like thinking about the Blue Mountains at this big scale. You can see on this map, the Blue Mountains mapped out with a level 3 ecoregion boundary that extends all the way from the Cascades. You can see all the way from Warm Springs Indian Reservation, all the way up through the Umatilla Indian Reservation, up to the edge of the Nez Perce. And if you down in the south, the Burns Paiute tribe down there, it's an incredible region, reaching all the way from the Cascades to the Rockies with a forested corridor. And we know it's a key connector between the Cascades and Rockies, very important for addressing climate change and with such amazing cultural diversity as well. And this is one of the most amazing features of the Blue Mountains. This single ecoregion that I just showed you bridges the gap between the two largest mountain ranges in North America, the Cascades and the Rocky Mountains. One ecoregion bridges that gap. That's quite remarkable. And you can see in this map on the left that to the north, the Palouse Prairie, we know what sort of serious land conversion has occurred there. To the south, the Great Basin, a much more intact region, but certainly a very different biome. The Blue Mountains is a very unique forested corridor. On the right, when you zoom in, what this map is showing is the average direction that mammals, birds, and amphibians need to move to track climates as they shift across the landscape. Not necessarily that they have the conditions to achieve that movement, but where they would if opportunity existed. And you can see the Blue Mountains is a major natural corridor here. Just while I've lived here in Northeast Oregon, we've experienced the return of moose, the return of wolves, just things that give you a lot of hope for the future of our planet. This is also just a remarkable region with its own topography. The mountain ranges on the left is a digital elevation model with low elevation in brown, high elevation in blue. You can see the Blue Mountains has a lot of high mountain ranges and in between low valleys where the people live, where the agricultural systems are. The high mountains tend to be where the national forests are. It's just an incredibly complex region with some very deep canyons, of course, the deepest in North America. That canyon system reaches all the way around into the west of La Grande with the Meacham Canyon, just incredible canyon system, amazing grasslands. All of this topographic complexity interacts with a very interesting hydrologic system where, of course, you have orographic uplift as moisture is lifting up over these mountains, but you also have this very unique air intrusion through the Columbia River Gorge. I grew up in the gorge, so I saw a lot of these influxes, these water movements and storms in both directions. But the general pattern is for the maritime influence to cross through this incredible canyon through the Cascade Mountains and hit right into the northern blues. On the right, you can see that precipitation variation across the Blue Mountains that just adds to the complexity. As a whole, the Blue Mountains compose the headwater streams for our region, very important hydrologically. You can see in this map that a lot of the streams that flow off that go into the much drier adjacent ecoregions, the Columbia Plateau or south into the Great Basin, they originate in the Blue Mountains with those high mountains receiving the snowpack and then feeding these streams that supply much of our region with its water. I am sometimes driving around, like many people that live here, and just struck by the awe, beauty, and functionality of this region. This is a cloud bank coming over a glass hill near La Grande. You see these air masses coming in, and they're just beautiful the way they can ride over the land like waves, just surfing the topography. Just a beautiful, beautiful region. And of course, the hydrologic complexity is reflected in the biophysical measurements. On the left, you have land surface temperature. Two amazing observations about the Blue Mountains is just the overall thermal heterogeneity. National forests are outlined in black, the private lands in red. These are the maximum surface temperatures in summer, huge gradients over very short distances because of all the complex land cover types. And then also you can see the gradient of cooler temperatures in the northern and central blues where you get more precipitation. Also on the right, you can see it's reflected in the potential vegetation groups across the national forest. There's a large variation in these potential vegetation group types. You can see in the Umatilla and Wallowa-Whitman, there's just a lot more moist and cold forest types than in the Malheur and Ochoco. So very different and unique ecologies across the Blue Mountains. And one of the unique things about our region as well is, this was an interesting study that was looking at just ecosystems all over Oregon and Washington, and not just looking at the ecology, looking at that and the species composition, but also looking at infrastructure and population and places where where fire can still perform its natural ecological role more functionally on the landscape. And you can see that the Blue Mountains, as an ecoregion, you can generally see was much higher than a lot of the rest of the area. In Wallawology, we've been really doing our part, to get out and teach people about the ecology with our forest managers that are doing prescribed burns. Here's a hike we led out just right off Salt Creek Summit to get people viscerally into the environment. We had a woman doing artwork with charcoal on this hike, and just taking in the aftermath of the prescribed fire so that we can continue to support our agencies in doing this kind of important work on the ground. And then, of course, you see, just the diversity of forest types. It all kind of comes together in this. There's the Blue Mountains BM ecoregion that you've seen, and also note the East Cascades, EC, those two ecoregions in Oregon. They're just incredibly diverse, indicated by the variety of colors that you see that represent these different forest type groups, ranging all the way from these drier systems and higher elevation systems, juniper and ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine, into these moisture dug fir, mountain hemlock, and spruce fir systems across the region, and the unique distribution that you've seen. And so we have a real diversity of old growth forest on our systems and just forest types that are just striking across sometimes very short distances. You see incredibly different types of forests. It's really the most diverse region that I've ever worked in. And so I want to shift gears here and talk a little bit about large diameter trees now. There's just been a lot of research on this. Of course, this is a paper that summarizes it globally, looking across a lot of ecosystems at the importance of large diameter trees. A lot of systems on Earth, of course, have experienced a lot of heavy logging. And so it's not just, that's part of the reason that scientists are interested in large trees, because we've lost a lot of our ancient forests around the world. And yet there are some, of course, that remain. And of course, the variety of functions of old growth trees, from the great appreciation that people find in the spiritual presence, to the watershed values, the wildlife values, the snags, the downed logs, the hollow logs that we see, just incredible habitat and values amongst large trees. And this study was also just pointing out that, in some of these forests around the world, the largest 1% of trees can comprise 50% of the biomass in those systems. Not all are that high, but it does tend to range between 2 to 5%. But no one really knew what the answer to that question was in Eastern Oregon in the Blue Mountains. And this was something that my co-authors and I looked at here. And you can see in the map on the lower right there, there's that Blue Mountains ecoregion and its national forest with the national forest within the East Cascades. That's a huge, huge area there. Right now, we're thinking about the Blue Mountains Forest Plan revisions, and that's a large area too. This is over twice that big. So it's this type of project area where we really start to interface more directly and powerfully with climate, because you can have such big impacts over a big area like this, particularly when you're starting to deal with the trees that store the most carbon. Just a little background, the 21-inch rule was started in 1994, enacted in 1994, mostly as a wildlife protection measure originally. And after a century of old growth logging in this region, we had lost so much of that habitat. Old growth species were in decline. And so it was really about slowing the loss of large older trees to protect habitat. So that was a big step for our region. And recently there was a proposal to, of course, weaken this protective measure for all trees from a standard to a guideline, a significant weakening of this protection measure for all trees, all species, but particularly for grand fir, opening the door to logging from trees between up to 150 years old and up to 30 inches diameter at breast height outside of designated old growth areas. So this was a big, big shift in management of old growth forests. And, I want to present to you some of the science on carbon for why, I think it's such great news for the forest, for the wildlife, and for our climate that that change has been recently overturned by a federal judge, and the 21-inch rule is back in place. And so, when we started out looking at this, we first wanted to know, how does tree diameter change with above ground carbon in these variety of species that represent the variety of ecosystem types across the Blue Mountains? And, as you can see in that graph there, when trees are small, tree diameter on the x-axis, tree above ground carbon is practically nothing. And you can see my son there, this is quite a few years ago. He's holding that little ponderosa pine sapling there. If we went back and looked at that little sapling now, it wouldn't be much different. And that kind of a tree is not going to do much to help him or any other buddy's future with regards to stabilizing the climate crisis. It's just the mature trees, as you can see, as trees get bigger, they really start putting on the carbon faster. The 21-inch rule is the dashed line. And you can see at that point, trees really start to take off fast in their carbon stores. Trees that are 21 inches in diameter, they can be storing 6 times as much carbon as even a 10-inch tree. So it's a really big jump in storage as you get into these bigger trees, and in growth. They just grow much, much, much faster during this critical window of time, this decade that is so pressing for us right now to keep carbon out of the atmosphere. So we showed that only 3% of the trees in Eastern Oregon's national forest are actually 21 inches or larger, but they hold, for some species, almost half the overall above ground carbon. So that's, just to summarize that in a new paper that you can see here. Please go ahead and look at this paper. It also shows some really interesting temperature differences between our moist forest types and our dry forest types, some of the thermal buffering that we brought into our work there. But this figure shows that, summarizes our results. Just those 3% of trees storing on average 42% of the carbon in the forest system. 97% of the trees less than 21 inches are storing 58% of the carbon, of course. And then summarized by species. And you see there's no great anomalies by species. They all range about in that window. Grand fir being the lowest proportion, over 21 inches. And so all of them more or less in that similar range though. So clearly the message is that these large trees are crucial for the climate. system right now. And if we want to be focused on keeping carbon out of the atmosphere, these are important trees to focus on. So it's also a time just to think about and reflect on these different management paradigms and the time spans of these trees. Here's a cambium peeled tree on the right. The Nez Perce would sometimes peel these trees. Most of them, are lost due to logging, but some of them remain. And, to think about how a culture interacted with these trees, and those trees are still alive and growing on the landscape today, right where we need them. That is a big thing to think about. The sensitive relationship with nature. Here's an incredible individual, Silas Whitman, Nez Perce elder and fisheries expert at the Chief Joseph Summer Camp, talking to the kids about all of these things: water, fish, big trees. Camping at the Imnaha River and just hearing fish so abundant that it would keep you up at night. Just an amazing, amazing stories. Also, just to reflect upon trees that are 150 years old. Here where I live, that would be about 1873. A tree germinated in 1873. That's a long time ago around here. And you start doing some exercises, thinking about 140-year-old tree, 130-year-old tree. What have those trees been through on this planet? How many winters? How many heat waves? How many fires? How many seasonal extremes and insect outbreaks? These trees have survived an immense amount of time. They've been storing and sequestering carbon through both world wars. Before the first Model T rolled off the assembly line. It's pretty, I think, important and easy to see that these trees have been very resilient in our landscape, and there's an important perspective that we have to keep these trees around as we're going forward right now. So I want to shift gears here a little bit and talk about strategic forest reserves and thinking about the whole forest system. I want to acknowledge my co-author, Beverly Law, for leading this research. And really what this research is about is, in response to these calls that you saw in the IPCC report, to protect 30% and 50% of nature as intact systems. The Western US has received much less attention than other places. And so we looked at this and examined the value of every single forested pixel across the entire Western United States, ranked them each for their biodiversity, for their water, for their carbon, and did it by ecoregion so that we could capture the diversity of ecological facets across all of the Western United States. And we looked at the areas that would then be loaded up into a system to show progressively the highest ranked areas, basically, to meet these protection area targets. And so, what that work shows is that we can still meet these protected area targets across the Western United States in every single state. And I say it that way because we looked at forest vulnerability to things like wildfire and drought and ruled out the most vulnerable areas, and we were still able to meet those targets. So this is just a great example of applied research that we can do right here to solve some of our most pressing problems. And now the managers and the social will needed to implement these actions. So this data set, strategic forest reserves, identifies where protections would be most effective for climate mitigation and conserving biodiversity. We find that federal public lands comprise 61 of these high preservation priority forest areas, and that Oregon has the largest forested area, but the lowest proportion protected of all 11 states, 10%. And we also found that substantial progress could be made by protecting these roadless and undeveloped lands. So 24 to 28% of those high priority federal lands were those roadless areas. And so we think about, how do we translate this data into a vehicle for a citizen's proposal? And I think that highlighted text gives us some insights. Thinking about these roadless areas, we know they're a known quantity. We know they're very rugged landscapes. And that's the reasons why basically they weren't logged. And they have a lot of high integrity values. We also took another step and we looked at this landscape with 30-meter resolution in another paper led by Dr. Law. We looked at this landscape 30-meter resolution, and we brought in landscape resilience as a metric, and really looked at the impacts on surface drinking water very carefully in this study. And the resilience metric is important to bring in because it starts to become more sensitive to the presence of these undeveloped regions and roadless landscapes. So that comes out in this data set a little bit more. I also want to draw your attention to the protected forest mapped in purple there. These are mostly wilderness areas in the Blue Mountains. And our study is showing that these high levels of protections are really, really important to meet the intent of what we're calling for with regards to protecting intact nature. Of course, I live here by the Eagle Cap Wilderness. It's an awesome place to live and get to be next to that mountain range every day. We absolutely love it. And I also want to point out that, it hasn't always been easy to achieve protections in Oregon. And when you look at our largest wilderness area, I don't think a lot of people realize that, in our neighboring states, like Washington, it wouldn't even be in the top 5 as the biggest wilderness area. Idaho, Montana, just big wilderness areas. And that quote from Senator Bob Packwood below, which is just a lot of real, truth, a politician speaking truth there. And this isn't just about one state having as much as the next. This play has real ecological consequences to the state of Oregon. Why? Because of the fundamentals of reserve protection and design, and particularly in context of the climate and biodiversity crises that we face, we need large connected networks. We know that bigger reserves are better, more diversity is protected in them. They also buffer the adjacent landscapes. So this has real implications for what we have protected in our state. And of course, leaving these intact landscapes unprotected means that there are a lot of other outcomes that could happen. And so when we turn to the Blue Mountains and look at its existing Gap 1 protections, mostly there are these wilderness areas here. And you can see that none of them are next to each other. None of them are joined together like you would see in a lot of other states and regions. They're all separated by some very large distances, some not so large. The only multi-unit wilderness complex in the North Fork, John Day, of course, you can see the much closer distances there, but all along the Southern Blues divide there, all along there's big distances between these protected areas. So when you think about the importance of the Blue Mountains as a connective corridor, this is simply not going to protect the species, their habitat requirements, and their movement needs across the Blue Mountains. Then you bring in what's happened in between these areas, and it's a bit of a shock. We live in a very eroded area. There's a lot that's happened in between these areas to make movement very challenging for species. But if you squint, you can see there's a lot of these gray areas out there too. Okay, across the Blue Mountains, these kind of gray patches on national forest lands. I've highlighted a little area in red. Those gray areas are the roadless areas. So let's zoom in on that area in red. So that area right there is actually the Joseph Canyon roadless area, right next to the Wild Horse area. And you can also see in the map on the left that I've mapped out these other roadless areas in orange, the Hells Canyon National Recreation Area in crosshatch. And then to the north of these two large roadless areas, the Nez Perce Precious Lands, the tribal lands there, further north, BLM lands. The Washington State has been the Chief Joseph Wildlife Management Area, has been purchasing lands. BLM has been purchasing lands along the Grand Ronde River, trying to create a network up to the Wanaha River. So when I came across this area, this roadless area, I realized that, wow, this place has incredible potential to be a significant core area in between the Wanaha 2 Canyon and the Hells Canyon, to bridge that connectivity gap, to serve not only as a corridor, but as itself a core habitat where species can find refuge, escapement, and populations as they're moving across and living in this landscape. And when you zoom out a little bit more on the right and look at the terrestrial resilience, you see that, this is landscape resilience, folks. This is big picture resilience based on permeability, the ability of species to move across the landscape, and the topographic complexity of the land. And you can see how tightly coupled it is with these big roadless areas. So these roadless areas are an important opportunity for us to continue to work and build a system across the Blue Mountains. And it's not just about that area. There's 2.2 million acres of these unprotected, large roadless areas in the Blue Mountains. These areas are, in many senses, have just as good wilderness or habitat as the wilderness areas. They're just as beautiful. In many areas, they're part of it. They're right next door to those wilderness areas, and actually protecting them would be protecting the functionality that we enjoy today. There's no doubt that these roadless areas are creating the kind of experience that we enjoy in the Blue Mountains here today. And so these are places, some of them protected, but with opportunities for expansion all around them, and with some science mixed in, these water towers of the Blue Mountains ecoregion, the Wallowas, the Elkhorns, the Strawberries, Glacier Mountain, the Aldrich Mountains, all could be in here. The lower elevation roadless areas around the Eagle Cap Wilderness, incredible habitat for lynx, for marten, for fisher, lots of moist forest. Look at the moss on the forest floor. You would think you were somewhere in the Coast Range. Incredible areas that we have the opportunity to still protect. I just was in a conversation with someone telling me, it was actually Jamie telling me that 25% of the steelhead population of the Snake River Basin comes up the Grand Ronde River. Incredible hydrologic system. And thank you to the Forest Service people that are on that district doing restoration work in the upper Grand Ronde Basin. We're definitely paying attention and really love to see that good work going on. And this, to have a roadless area on the main stem of a river here, that's just awesome to have that in 2023. Natural disturbances, wildlife, we could protect landscapes like this. And the old growth, the ancient forests across the Blue Mountains, the Lookout Mountain roadless area, famous for its ancient pine, the Imnaha River corridor as well. Some of the places where we can still get a sense of what the ponderosa pine were once like in this incredible region, 500-year-old trees, one tree, two trees could fill a log truck, amazing. These trees we're not going to be seeing back in our lifetime, but there's a few places where they still are found, and that's in these roadless areas primarily. And these big wildlands, I took this picture not long after the Double Creek fire. You can see in the background some of the black area where it meets the golden grasslands, the rains coming in. I'm going to enter this in the Josephi art contest and have some fun with it. I've entitled it Renewal. And then, of course, Joseph Canyon, these precious lands, Condor Canyon, Ananasokum, the home of where Chief Joseph was born, and where our Chemist to Condors Coalition has our focal landscape. We're interested in connectivity all across the landscape, across all jurisdictions, private land, public land, all of tribal land, and it really brings into focus the value of having some areas that are still highly intact on the landscape. And the incredible cultural values. So, there's now a Blue Mountains trail across this ecoregion. It goes, it's an amazing place to have this trail connecting not just all these beautiful wilderness areas, but look how it goes through a lot of these big roadless areas. So an awesome opportunity to understand the values of these incredible large roadless areas and experience this trail through the Blue Mountains. So, we have the opportunity now to dream big. And we should. You know, this is a crucial decade for our planet, for our children's future. This is the time to dream big about what our Earth and our world could be, and to take action right here at home. The Eagle Cap Wilderness, our state's biggest wilderness area, if we just expanded the roadless areas around it, and we took some targeted restoration measures, precision restoration measures, emphasized there on the right hand, we could expand that wilderness area and make it much more whole, much more larger, and connect that roadless area all together with the Eagle Cap. You know, and also start to bring those connections together with the Snake River and the Hells Canyon region as well. Also note in the top of that picture, what you see there is an orange area called the Lower Wildlife Management Area. That was an area recently brought out of Hancock timberland, and actually maybe now under the ownership of Manulife timberland. You know, these private timberlands are changing hands quickly, and brought into public ownership with the work of the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. So we're incredibly excited about that. And I just want to highlight, you know, when we talk about this incredible achievement now, this conservation legacy, we see that the Minam River Wildlife Area acquisition that's been acquired here, it's right next to the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest and the federally designated Eagle Cap Wilderness. That's something that we can say today, but it wasn't always like that. The Lower Minam was added to the wilderness in 1984. And, you know, it's been that long, since 1984, since a single acre of wilderness was added to any national forest in the Blue Mountains. And when we look at how good those wilderness areas work today, all the different challenges we face, that scientists are calling for protections across the earth, it's really time to look at revisiting these tools and their value on the landscape. Even on the right now, you can see how that conservation legacy continues to inform our actions. The Huckleberry inventoried roadless area, hey, that's a no-brainer to be added to the Eagle Cap Wilderness. And it's people like this, people like Marilyn Kripe. I just had the opportunity to spend a weekend with her and her husband, Gene, at their house. Here's her, you know, at the state capitol, working on the Lower Minam wilderness area. She has her briefcase that she hand carved there. Marilyn was born and raised in Ukiah, Oregon. On the back side of that suitcase is a Save the Lower Minam sticker. At this time, when this campaign was happening, signs were all over LeGrand for the protection of the Lower Minam. School children were singing to the politicians. It was an incredible, incredible period, and it all came from the work, or a lot of it came from the work of Eastern Oregonians. And I think those are stories we need to tell about our own communities and neighbors. At the right, the Hells Canyon, Marilyn also worked on that. And here she is in her house, standing by a letter from Senator Bob Packwood, thanking her for her work to help protect the Hells Canyon Wilderness and National Recreation Area. So as we look forward, a Blues Mountains reserve system is something that is very achievable, and that would go great distances to protecting the incredible potential of this ecoregion. We really need large, protected, and connected natural neighborhoods. These are our neighborhoods, folks. These are where we live, where we hunt, where we play, where we hike, where we work. We have the opportunity to protect these areas in our own region. We could provide wildlife connectivity across the system. Old growth and large trees would be better protected. We could have much better water security for fish, agriculture, and drinking water, the protection of cultural and historic resources, cross-jurisdictional planning for protection and connectivity, like with Joseph Canyon, Wild Horse, and the Nez Perce Precious Lands. And we really need these Gap 1, these strong protections for our intact watersheds, such as wilderness. I want to thank you very much for being with me here tonight. It's a pleasure to present to you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I am going to quickly share my screen, which maybe Jamie or David, if you can nod that you're seeing that, that's great. Well, yeah, as ever, David, I am thankful for your ability to take really complex information and make it accessible. I appreciate your making a really eloquent case for the unique values of our region and really candidly addressing the threats and opportunities that we're working through. Um, I'm going to briefly set the stage for Jamie to tell us how we can make sure to take advantage of some opportunities that are right in front of us. And indeed, we will make sure to leave plenty of time for questions. So thanks to everybody who's sticking with us here. Oh, that slide was supposed to be up earlier, but that's okay. So much of the Blue Mountain ecoregion that David talked about is managed by the U.S. Forest Service. These lands are not the only lands that matter, but they provide some of the best opportunities to make important gains or lock in irreversible damage at a massive scale. And because they're public lands, to the extent that they belong to anybody, they belong to all of us equally. And the agency is full of good people, and its mission isn't much different from groups like Oregon Wild. But unfortunately, due to history, politics, greed, flawed policies, weaponized social divisions, we find ourselves at odds far too often. The good news is that thanks to bedrock environmental laws, the agency has duties still to protect and restore ecological and public values and provide opportunities for all members of the public to be meaningfully heard. Appropriately, sovereign indigenous people do have unique rights and special relationships with government agencies, and I believe we should all give them especially serious consideration. We value our relationships with these multifaceted communities, and we're working to strengthen them, but I want to be clear again that we do not speak for anyone other than ourselves. We felt compelled, though, to bring you this presentation because the Forest Service has embarked upon a process to update forest plans on millions of acres of public lands in the Malheur, Umatilla, and Wallowa-Whitman National Forests. Those are really crudely outlined in red on the connectivity map that David showed us earlier. Again, really diverse and incredibly complex landscapes with tremendous ecological, cultural, and intrinsic value. And so a forest planning process is exactly what it sounds like. Forest plans guide the management of these forests. They inform decisions about logging, grazing, law enforcement, recreation, wildlife, water, plants, protected designations, and really just about anything you can think of. They can be in effect for generations, and they are hugely consequential. And so in this age of climate change, biodiversity collapse, social unrest, and increasing development, scientists and the general public are starting to increasingly understand that simply we can't afford to get it wrong, especially in the next 10 to 30 years. So it brings me absolutely no pleasure to note that things don't seem to be headed in the right direction, and the agency has already allowed some interest to put their thumb on the scales for literally years before engaging with the broad public. This is the third time the agency has tried to update these plans since they were enacted over 30 years ago. Previous efforts failed for reasons that we won't get into today. And when the last proposal was withdrawn under criticism from nearly everyone, the agency promised to take a step back, let the dust settle, and work on other priorities before starting over. Unfortunately, though, those priorities have been to propose more and bigger industrial logging projects that are greenwashed by misleading language and nominal collaborative groups. They've ignored obligations to address ongoing damage from livestock operations, off-road travel, and other destructive activities. And they also undertook this ham-fisted effort to undermine effective protections for our last remaining large and old-growth trees on over 7 million acres of public lands that David mentioned earlier. And as a quick aside, we were pleased when a judge recently found that those efforts were illegal. The fight isn't over, but we appreciate our conservation and tribal allies with whom we continue to proudly stand alongside them. Going forward, it doesn't need to be a fight. We stand ready and always have to work towards a more durable solution than what the Trump administration and timber industry allies tried to force on us. Sadly, though, rather than do something different, the lessons that the agency seems to have learned from those failures has led them to dive back into the forest planning process in an extremely concerning manner. Rather than starting a new process with all members of the public on equal footing that's grounded in modern science and 21st century public values, the agency partnered with a new outfit called the BIC, or Blue Mountain Intergovernmental Council. Like any number of other nominally collaborative groups, it's been a very undemocratic, exclusive, and far less than transparent process that's dominated by a very narrow set of interests. The bulk of participants are local far-right politicians who don't represent broad swaths of the public that they claim to serve, and certainly not the 300 million plus Americans to whom these lands also belong. They also included state agencies that have also struggled to live up to broad public values and the conservation parts of their mission. nearly all of them generally align with extractive industries. And there has been a place at the table for tribes. However, and again, we don't speak for them, but we have heard from some of our tribal partners that their participation and ability to meaningfully impact the process and its decisions has been wildly overstated. The public has been allowed to listen to extremely long meetings that take place during workdays and are only allowed to speak for a few minutes as the meetings wrap up and participants kind of begin to pack their bags up. The Forest Service has worked with this really exclusive and biased group for several years to develop their desired outcomes, and it's only now that they're embarking on a legally required public process. And so, as you can imagine, we're very concerned, but we still believe that it's important to participate in good faith and to encourage the public, and especially the communities we represent, to do the same. So before I hand it out or hand it off to Jamie, I want to reiterate that even if you're not as lucky as David, Jamie, and I to have these amazing landscapes in our backyards, they don't belong to us any more than they belong to you. As you heard from David, whether you live in Portland, Corvallis, Joseph, Bend, Boise, or the Yukon, the health of these landscapes directly affects you. If you simply enjoy nature and enjoy these places for their intrinsic values, or to recreate or to watch wildlife, if you only benefit from the clean water they provide and want them to be around for future generations, you have a right to speak and be heard. And even if you're not an expert in ecology, forest management, public lands policy, logging systems, or wildlife protections, your voice matters. So with that, Jamie is going to talk about how you can get involved and the values we hope the agency will hear from you, the public, that has so far been excluded from this very important process. And then again, we'll take those questions.
Thanks for having me. And I promise I'll be real quick. I have 4 slides. You can count them on one hand, and then we can get to Q&A. I'm Jamie Dawson. I'm the Conservation Director at Greater Hells Canyon Council up here in Northeast Oregon. This is our mission: connect, protect, and restore these wildlands, waters, and habitats of the Greater Hells Canyon region. Here is my 2-minute spiel on how you can get involved and what to consider as you're doing it. Oregon Wild has a petition that is a good way for you to get future information about more opportunities. I think Rob's going to share that afterwards and probably put it in the chat right now. And perhaps the most pressing thing that you can do in the next 7 days to impact the next 30 years of these Blue Mountains forests is to attend a virtual open house that the Forest Service is hosting next Tuesday night from 4 to 7 p.m. This is a kind of drop-in style, so even if you only have 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 30 minutes, it's worth going. And yeah, you can come anytime during that window from 4 to 7 p.m. It's going to be on Zoom, and we have the link that we'll put in the chat and also send out after this presentation. The expected format, it's going to be probably kind of funny. There'll maybe be a short presentation from the Forest Service in the beginning, and then it's going to, I'm guessing, be open to any comments or questions from any person. And they have had a number of small open houses around Eastern Oregon, but as you all know, many people who don't live close to these forests use these forests and love these forests. So for this early stage of the planning process, this looks to be the only opportunity for folks that don't live immediately adjacent to a National Forest office to be able to participate in an open house. And this early process is called the assessment phase. It's like before the environmental review even starts, and it's literally just the Forest Service taking people's temperatures on what issues do they care about, what questions do they have, just to kind of set the stage for the rest of the process. So if you're able to attend, even if it's just for a few minutes, I'd recommend coming prepared with a comment or a question. As Rob said, you do not need to be an expert. It's the Forest Service's job to make sure that this process is understandable and available to everybody. So don't feel intimidated if you don't have the perfect scientifically, worded question or something that's based on a previous environmental review or a document. It can just be something that you value and care about for this, the future of these public lands. These plans are only supposed to last for 15 years, and this one was written in the 80s, and I think it was published in 1990. So there's a very good chance that whatever makes it into this plan will be, the law of the land for the rest of my career. So this is, I feel like, simultaneously one of the most boring things and one of the most important things that related to public lands in Eastern Oregon. So if you're able to attend, here are some things for you to consider. I'm sure everyone has their own interests and things that you want to ask about, but here are a couple concerns, at least from Greater Hells Canyon Council's perspective. Some of our top issues, as David has so eloquently spoken about today, these lands from a carbon perspective, from a wildlife habitat perspective, from a migration corridor perspective, are absolutely critical. And they are some of the most heavily eroded forests in the country, in the entire national forest system. So if there is any place that miraculously does not have a road built to it by, this year, 2023, it should stay that way, because it is disproportionately ecologically valuable to a number of species. And so you can ask a question or make a comment about, what are your plans for protecting unroaded areas or roadless areas or wilderness areas? And that's a part of the process that they're actually going through right now, is considering potential wilderness that the Forest Service itself would actually propose as part of this forest plan. For wildlife corridors, as both David and Rob showed, these public lands are important on a continental scale. This is one of the only east to west, west to east corridors between the Rocky Mountains and the Cascades. So again, the incredible weight of protecting that line of wildlife habitat connectivity, the weight of that falls on the Forest Service's shoulders. And so letting them know that that's something that you care about for whatever reason it is, whether it's just you love to go watch elk or you love to chase elk with a trad bow, letting them know that wildlife habitat connectivity is something that you care about is really important. And we're really lucky in Oregon. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife recently released this amazing data, a whole map of the state, showing the most important pieces of wildlife habitat, kind of core areas and corridors connecting them. So it'd be worth asking them, how are they planning to incorporate that data from our state wildlife agency? And how are they, kind of considering and contextualizing the importance of these wildlife corridors, and what are they going to do to maintain or even improve them? From a climate change perspective, as David pointed out, in Eastern Oregon, the Blue Mountains forests, they're kind of the best we have. Like, they might be the most valuable acres in Eastern Oregon, from the perspective of acres of public lands that can pull pull carbon pollution out of the air and store it. And so how are they planning to utilize climate change as, one of the lenses through which they are considering the future 15, 30 plus years of managing these forests, and not just within a context of fire and logging? I feel like anytime I ask a question about climate change on national forests, the short and easy answer is like, oh, well, we need to log it so that it doesn't burn, so that it can keep storing carbon. But that makes a lot of assumptions, including that burned areas have zero carbon storage, which is not true. That's not good enough. We need to know that the agency is thinking about all of the other acres that may not burn during the 15 to 30 plus years tenure of this land management plan. So if you care about climate change, that would be something worth bringing up. And finally, big trees, as was already mentioned earlier this evening, we know that there is very little old growth left in the United States, really. And you've probably heard us referencing big trees or mature trees. There's all these different ways to say it. We're basically talking about pre-old growth, the trees that will become old growth, that aren't quite there yet, but they're in some cases the best we have, and they're serving as a surrogate for old growth in a lot of circumstances. So the Eastside Screens 21-inch rule that was referenced earlier, that doesn't exist like on its own as a, something that Congress created. That lives inside these forest plans. And so when the new forest plans are made, the Eastside Screens could exist, could not exist. They could exist in some other version. There's no way to know how the Forest Service will handle that. So if protecting big trees, mature trees, old growth trees, any kinds of trees is important to you, that's something worth bringing up as well. And yeah, I think my hope is this plan was, designed in the 80s. So much has changed, including, the scientific information that we have access to. and what we value these lands for. So I certainly am hoping for a forest plan that is much more inclusive of the many different values and reasons that these lands are important. And the only way that's going to happen is if people, speak up and let the Forest Service know that there are many reasons that we care about these lands and that they need to protect those as well. So we can't do that without your help. And I hope that you'll be able to attend this open house next Tuesday. And if you can't, that's also okay. There's going to be a number of other opportunities coming up that we'd like to keep you in the loop on, but just make sure that you sign that petition so we know that we'd like to be contacted about it. And so with that in mind, why don't we go ahead and get to some Q&A, and I'll turn it back over to Rob. And you're muted.
Of course I am. Yeah, I will briefly share my screen here. Just finish on a pretty picture here. Yeah, thanks to everybody. And I've just lost the question and answers. There they are. So we're gonna sorry, give me one more moment. Yeah, so thank you again for that. Yeah, and thanks to everyone for sticking around. Now's the time that we're going to have a discussion and answer your questions. We are past the hour mark, but we're going to get to as many of those questions as we can and encourage as many of you to stick around as you can. You're welcome to reach out to us after tonight. And then also want to note that we have put links in the chat, and a couple folks caught that there was a mistake on the slide. The virtual house is on October 10th, next Tuesday, October 10th. And just a reminder, we will follow up with a recording of this video. Please look out for that. Share it with folks who might be interested. Do sign our petition. Please support our and other organizations who advocate for your values. And again, I think the most important thing, if you really want to step up, is to join that open house next week, October 10th, and make sure you speak up. We're not sure what the format will be, but it is there for you to say what you want to say. So find a way to say it. And importantly, yeah, I guess actually that we'll just leave it there. So a couple of questions. I'm going to just throw a really quick and discreet one out there. David, in your very early presentation, you had a slide with the changing climate over the last 16,000 years and a thing that said LGMR. What did LGMR stand for?
Yeah, that stands, let's see, the last glacial maximum result reanalysis. So it refers to the data sets used, the variety of data sets used to create that reanalysis from the period backwards on that graph. So it's the last glacial maximum reanalysis.
Gotcha. I'm going to summarize a bunch of questions as statements about David. You're awesome. Bravo, David. Fantastic presentation, David. Not a question, just huge appreciation for David and his passion for what we can and need to do, and just all sorts of folks who think you're awesome, just like we do. So thank you, David, for that.
Thank you.
And then, so a lot of great questions in here, and in no particular order. I'm just going to pick this one. What is recommended wilderness? Why is it important? And what should the public be asking of the Forest Service if they value wild lands?
David, you went through the forest planning process last time, so if you wouldn't mind answering that one.
Yeah, and we were actually just talking about this yesterday. So, the Forest Service, generally, my understanding of this, and, Rob, Jamie, please help me out if I'm off on this, but my understanding is that the Forest Service generally stays, very apolitical with wilderness. It's not something that they are actively seeking for any of their lands, as I showed you in my presentation, just highlighting the people like us, the community members, the public that has put these proposals forward historically, and that's true across the nation. Some people say that every green place on the map has a story behind it, and it's really amazing because it is that interaction between the public and science in a very real way. So the Forest Service is not engaged in the advocacy for wilderness, but When the forest plan rolls around every so often, they look at every single roadless area on their national forest, every single one, and they break them down on all this kinds of criteria: manageability, solitude, historical, cultural values, wildlife, geology. And they're very interesting documents. There's a lot of great information in them. And so it's part of the Forest Service's analysis of those areas to see if in the forest plan process, they will make a recommendation to wilderness. My understanding is that recommendation is essentially to Congress to say, hey, this area, has a green light. We think it meets those values. So that's my understanding of recommended wilderness. It's a kind of a unique once in a forest plan type thing that comes around. Rob, Jamie, anything to help me out on that?
Yeah, I might just add in the last go around, it was one of the things that I think was just embarrassing from the Forest Service perspective, or should have been, is that we have a citizens inventory of these places that have been ground truth and scientifically validated. And I forget the number of acres, but I want to say it was in the hundreds of thousands of acres that are legitimately are of wilderness quality. And the agency proposed something like a couple of hundred. It's a very political thing out here. And again, that's why we need to make sure all people's voices are heard. It was scientifically defensible, public values, it's defensible, and just was really an embarrassment of the Forest Service falling short on that. So that's one of the things we really think they need to hear a lot about.
Yeah, and if I could just add, and when we talk about these kinds of landscapes that have had a lot of impact, the whole temperate forest biome would pretty much be in there. We talk about protecting and connecting and restoring. And so, we know how to restore the edges of these landscapes. We've done it before in Oregon in places like the Copper Salmon Wilderness. We can bring wilderness boundaries down to logical features, roads, rivers. We can do restoration and influence the ability of those areas to serve as wilderness areas. And I think that's very important for the Forest Service to think about, because as we go forward with some of these big intact forest landscapes, we have a choice. Are we going to chip away at them at the edges and then someday say, oh, look, there's just not enough left. There's no more solitude in there. Well, of course, you chose that path. Or are we going to choose the other path and say, hey, look, let's do some restoration around the edges. And there's plenty of solitude in these incredible landscapes.
Very briefly, there was a question about, can we learn more about the Blue Mountains Trail? I'm going to put a link in the chat of a webinar that we did that is on our YouTube channel. And of course, the Greater Hells Canyon Council has a whole webpage about it, including you can sign up for information about the trail, all sorts of really cool stuff there. So take a look at that. Another question, a good one here. What exactly about this ecoregion causes it to be an ecoregion? I'm looking for a planetary answer.
Great science question. Yeah, well, ecoregions, I describe this one as a level 3 ecoregion because they can be defined at vastly different scales. And, you mentioned a global answer. And well, if you were defining ecoregions at the global scale, you might go a little bit coarser. I used to do a lot of global scale research. And we would define the entire evergreen needle-leaf biome as one. We call the evergreen needle-leaf biome. So we would do a much more coarse scale lumping. And what it really gets at is, areas where ecosystems, their values, their environmental characteristics, their resources, their plant communities share similarities. And of course, we can break that down at a variety of different scales, but ecologically, we can look at areas and say, where are the similar environmental characteristics that define this area and put those ecological boundaries on the map? And we can do that at a lot of different spatial scales. Of course, the level 3 ecoregion is, I think, really good for the Blue Mountains because when you go another step further, what it does is it breaks out the valleys that are within the mountain ranges and starts to say, oh, well, maybe those are a different ecological unit. And so, that starts to, really tease apart some of the overall ecological function of that ecoregion. And, for the analysis that we're doing, we really want to be able to see that functionality holistically. So I hope that kind of answers your question. I'd encourage you to just go online and say, what is an ecoregion? Because there's a lot of different definitions, and go to the EPA website. The EPA makes those ecoregion maps and has a great definition online.
Thanks, David. I will note we're getting questions for more of the links. I'll remind folks we put them in the chat, and then we will send out tomorrow in an email to all these folks links to both the webinar, to the recording of this, as well as for the virtual town hall next Tuesday. I just want to also address a quick one. We've got a couple questions asking about the geological factors that explain the Blue Mountains region. That is such a cool question and so incredibly complex that I'm going to go ahead and suggest that we're going to see if we can put on a webinar. We have a great expert here, Ellen Morris Bishop, who we are so lucky to have her. She's a geologist who, like David, can put the most complex stuff in ways you can understand it. So I'm going to just skip that question and just keep an eye on our webinar series to see when we do that webinar, because I think she'll say yes. Another question here we have is, how have the big wildfires in the past several years affected this ecoregion?
Yeah, I can start, and then Jamie, please jump in. I just want to say that, we had these big fires in year before last, and I showed you a picture of them. Double Creek, we had some in the Wallowas. The Forest Service did, I think, an incredible job of managing for those wildfires in conditions where they could do so, which is a critical thing that we need to do as we try to as we're adapting to a new wildfire paradigm. And we've seen research on this, at the scale that is needed to have these ecological processes happening on the landscape. We need to let fire play out its role where we can. So big appreciation to the Forest Service and the work they did on letting those fires go, and also on the Imnaha fire, doing their best to what they could, because I know that was a tough situation. But now, as we're all looking at it, we're all saying, wow, these were good ecological impacts, across the board. Different agency people I'm hearing are saying that. So Jamie, any inputs? I know you're a big hunter and go out and experience these areas with disturbances, and what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, yeah, I'm still learning, but it's always really interesting to get out there and see how much use those burned areas are still getting from other species. They do provide a whole flush of huckleberries. Snags have a ton of bugs in them that all different kinds of, birds and even like omnivorous mammals are digging around in. It's sort of just one of the seasons of life of a forest, right? And so, though we are looking at a present and future with climate changed fires that are a bit more intense, it's still important to remember that in this part of the state, they're so critical to the functioning of the ecosystem. And so they can be very stressful for humans, but they're so important.
Mm-hmm.
And I would add, I was privileged this spring to take a Lighthawk flight. Lighthawk is this great nonprofit that takes conservation group scientists and others up in airplanes that we couldn't otherwise afford to go up in. And we looked at some of those fires that burned last year. And it's so interesting to see that when you hear people talk about, catastrophic fire and 20,000 acres or 200,000 acres, you get the idea that it's all just a charred wasteland. And no doubt some parts of some of these fires just look charred. They're nuked. But then there are other parts where you could put somebody in and they would think that place had never been touched by fire before, and everything in between. They are mosaics. And so we have to keep that in mind, and especially in the backcountry, I think we do need to allow fire to do its thing more often. A lot of the problems we currently face is a fire deficit. These are fire-adapted landscapes, as we've heard before. And while we understand we can't let every single fire burn, similarly, we can't put every single one out. And that goes also, unfortunately, we hear so much of why we need to log our forests. So we use terms like thinning and restoration and resilience, but so many of them are old school industrial logging projects. What I think the science and conservation groups like ours tend to support is appropriate thinning, starting near the ignition zones of homes and communities, and then working your way out from there. So much of what we're seeing from the collaborative industrial complex is proposing these industrial logging projects in the backcountry, miles from the nearest paved roads, in landscapes that actually could really benefit from these fires. Another place where we could probably talk for a really long time, but I will say, just given the time, I want to see if we can just get to a couple more questions. And just again, yeah, there's a lot to be spoken of there, for sure. I just lost, there's a great question I had. Yeah, somebody asked, and I might just take the first stab at this, is one of the reasons that Oregon has fewer protected areas due to our reliance on ONC lands and monies rather than a sales tax system? Just wondering why we don't have more. We don't have ONC lands, as far as I know, here in Eastern Oregon. But indeed, Oregon is far behind all of our neighbors, including the wildly progressive environmental state of Idaho, in protecting our wilderness areas. And that's really unfortunate. We do have, I believe we tend to not have politicians who are living up to the values of the citizenry that they represent. We should be protecting a lot more of these places, but politics and money gets in the way. The timber industry, especially in Oregon, has just disproportionate political clout here. And I once heard my supervisor and our conservation director, Steve Pedry, say, timber is to Oregon as coal is to West Virginia. And it is true in so many different ways, including that nostalgia and this fear that if we protect these places, we're going to lock it up and we're going to destroy this economy. When in reality, our economy is not dependent upon extractive resources. There are tremendous benefits from protected wild places to local communities. These are not things that are at odds with one another. And so we really need to, somebody also once said, these are political questions, and politicians are like weather vanes, and it's our job to make the wind blow. And so that is why we really want you guys to get out there and speak to your values and make sure that the Forest Service and our elected officials here that we need to protect these places. And we're not talking about protecting landscapes that are already heavily eroded or your own personal backyard. We're talking about maintaining what we essentially have. We can't create new wilderness. We can really only destroy it. And so we are talking about protecting places that, and really honestly protecting things the way they are. If you want to live in a place that's got lots of pavement and cars and intensive agriculture, you can move to the Willamette Valley or Portland. If you want to live near big wild places, you should live in a place like this, and we should protect those places. I think it's key to protecting our way of life. Nobody's gonna add. Okay.
Yeah.
Two questions. One is, should the 21-inch rule be extended everywhere in Oregon? And actually, I'll just leave that there and see if anybody wants to answer that.
Okay, I'll take that one. No, I don't think so. There, the west side of Oregon is managed under the Northwest Forest Plan. That came around about the same time as the east side screens, which ushered in the 21-inch rule. And so, that's a good management plan for that region to be working under now. And of course, that plan is going to be looked at for revisions, and there's a team of people involved in that, and just really hoping that team is going to be thinking about the incredible values of those forests as well going forward. But it is in its own management regime under that Northwest Forest Plan. So, and I think the 21-inch rule is actually, when you look at it, there's a lot of relative consistency with the fire ecology of Eastern Oregon's forest. These big trees, they're the most fire-resistant trees generally on the landscape, and they're the most drought-resistant. They're the most deeply rooted. They can access the water systems and keep that water pump going, even in the summers, releasing water into the atmosphere, feeding downwind precipitation, cooling the environment. And so, at the same time, the ability, it doesn't put any restrictions on trees under 21 inches. So I think that's a very unique aspect of that rule and fits these ecosystems well. At the same time, of course, we need to think about protections that are holistic for these big landscapes and not rely on the 21-inch rule as a landscape protection tool. I was just out on a tour with some folks recently, and you go out there into the forest, and the only trees that are left are marked in white. It's called leave tree marking. Pretty much everything else goes. And some of the attendees of that tour were just, wow, really, all of it, and so there's a tremendous amount of biomass and carbon that is removed from the forest in thinning projects all the time, in trees under 21 inches. And that's something we certainly need to get a much better handle on. These large trees are crucial in their own role in the landscape, for the many values they provide. And of course, that fire resistance, that carbon storage, that water storage is absolutely crucial. But it doesn't replace the need for gap one, strong protections for our intact forest landscapes. That is actually the most critical need, I think, in Eastern Oregon's forest.
Yeah. I'll briefly just note, I think your point is right. One size fits all doesn't work for everywhere. And, there are some things that I think we could do with the screens rule that would be, that could be modernized, but it wasn't in the way that the Forest Service did it, where they essentially undermined the rule entirely over 9 million acres. There are maybe some specific cases where we could have some flexibility in that rule, but the way they went about it was extremely problematic. One thing you mentioned, David, there, that's important for folks to know too, is that, logging is Oregon's largest climate emitter. Even thinning projects that are relatively good emit carbon. Those big forest fires you see, even in some of the biggest ones, the vast majority of the carbon actually stays on site for a very, very long time, and certainly within these next 10 to 30 years. And there are different ways to address this, and we're working on different efforts around the country, including a national rule to protect mature and old growth forests. And we encourage folks to get involved in that. I think we're going to take just one or two more questions, because we are really probably pushing into people's in time. There are a lot of really great questions in this chat, and I want to encourage people to reach out to us. I'm really sorry we can't get to them all. My email address is rk@oregonwild.org. Jamie, can I share yours? Jamie@hellscanyon.org. I do. It's pretty easy. And then David, we can get yours out. We can get folks in touch with you as they're interested as well. So I want to just see, I thought we had one or two questions that were really relevant. Gosh, they are all really relevant. Maybe, does anybody see a favorite one? Yeah, go ahead, Jamie.
There's a number of questions that are sort of like, well, what about beavers? What about riparian protections? What about the difference between moist mixed conifer and dry forest? Lots of really good topic specific questions. And a lot of them are related to this specific thing. How do we make sure that the forest incorporates something positive about this value in the forest plan? The first step is to let them know that that's a value that you care about, whether it's attending the open house on October 10th, not October 4th, or just contacting the management team directly. There's a whole website that we'll link to in the email that has kind of the Forest Service's official information, as well as contact information for the team. So I would say the first step to getting something that you want in the forest plan is letting the Forest Service know that you want it in the forest plan. And that's where you should start.
Cool. And I think we'll leave it there, because as I was just scrolling through these questions, I can't pick one. They're all too good. So again, please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you want to ask additional questions. And I understand that helps people feel more comfortable in weighing in. But as we've talked about, you have every bit of right to be there, to show up, to ask your questions, to make your statements. It doesn't matter where you live, what your education is, what your interest is, quite frankly, whether or not you agree with us. So please keep an eye on your inbox for a link to the petition and a link to that webinar, and other ways to stay involved, and feel free to be in touch with any questions. Thank you, David, Willology and Eastern Oregon Legacy Lands, Jamie, and Greater Hells Canyon Council, and to my great colleagues at Oregon Wild who aren't here but are virtually behind me and help me manage this thing. Thanks to everybody for your time. Keep an eye out.
My pleasure. Thank you, Rob.
And thank you.
Thanks for having us.